In the crowded hallways of her high school, she had perfected the art of being invisible. It was a skill born not of magic, but of necessity. She moved through the sea of shouting, laughing, and shoving bodies like a small fish in a fast-moving river, hugging her textbooks to her chest and keeping her eyes fixed on a specific, worn-down spot on the linoleum floor. There was a crack there, right by the third water fountain, that splintered out like a tiny lightning bolt. If she just focused on that crack, she could navigate the chaos between classes without being touched, without being noticed, without being spoken to. Her clothes, always a little too big and a little too faded, were a kind of camouflage. They helped her blend into the background, a smudge of neutral color in a world that seemed to be painted in bright, bold strokes, but people noticed one thing. It was hard not to. Her hands. They had a mind of their own, a constant, fine tremor that made the world a little bit harder to hold on to. It was there when she tried to write, her pencil scratching and skittering across the page, turning a simple sentence into a shaky, barely legible scrawl. It was there when she picked up her lunch tray, the milk carton ratting in its little plastic square. To the other kids, it was just another weird thing about the quiet girl. They'd whisper, or sometimes not even whisper, calling her shaky hands or jelly fingers as she passed by. She would hear them, of course. She heard everything, but she never looked up. She just kept walking, her eyes on that crack in the floor. Her teachers saw it too, but they saw it as a problem to be categorized. In math class, Mr. Davison, a man who seemed perpetually tired, would sigh as he graded her papers. Her numbers, born from a trembling hand, would float and collide, making even the simplest equations look like a mess. "You need to focus more," he'd tell her, his voice flat. "You're a smart girl, but your work is sloppy." He didn't see the war she fought with her own body just to write down the number 7. He just saw the result. He didn't see the way she would clench her left hand with her right, trying to still the tremor for just a few seconds, a desperate, secret gesture under the desk. To them, her hands were a barrier, a sign of carelessness or maybe a lack of intelligence. They never once asked her why they shook. They just saw the shakes and they dismissed her, what no one at school ever knew. What was hidden beneath the bed in her small, second-floor apartment was her secret world. It was a world contained within a scuffed and dented violin case. The case itself was nothing special. It was covered in peeling black fabric, the kind that felt like cheap felt, and one of the metal latches was held together with a bent paper clip. It had come from a pawn shop downtown, a place that smelled of dust and forgotten things. Her mother had bought it for her on her 12th birthday. She remembered that day so clearly. Her mother, who worked 2 jobs and whose hands were always rough from cleaning other people's houses, had come home with the case hidden in a large canvas bag. She was breathless, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. She sat her down on their worn-out sofa, the one with the floral pattern that had faded into a ghost of its former self, and presented the bag to her as if it were a treasure chest. When she opened it and saw the violin inside, she didn't know what to say. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The wood was a warm, honey-brown color, and it seemed to glow in the dim light of their living-room lamp. Her mother had knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in her own steady ones. "I know," her mother had said, her voice soft but firm. "I know they shake. I know the world makes it hard for you. But I want you to listen to me. Your hands, they don't just shake. They have a song in them. I hear it when you tap your fingers on the table, when you trace patterns on the window pane. This," she said, gently touching the violin, "this will help that song come out. Don't ever let the world tell you to be quiet." Those words became her lifeline. Every day, after she finished her homework and her mother had left for her evening shift at the hospital, she would take out the violin. The apartment would be silent, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren. In that quiet space, she would tuck the instrument under her chin. Her hands would still tremble as she tightened the bow and rosined the horsehair. The first few notes were always a struggle, wobbly and unsure. But then something would happen. As she focused on the music, on the feeling of the strings vibrating against her chin and the wood humming against her chest, the shaking would change. It wouldn't disappear entirely, but it would become part of the music. The tremor would add a unique, wavering vibrato, a soulful quaver that she couldn't create on purpose. It was the sound of her struggle, and it was beautiful dot in her room with the door closed. She was not the invisible girl with the shaking hands. She was a musician. Her hands were not a source of shame, but the source of her voice. And she would play for hours, lost in the world of melodies and harmonies. Playing the song her mother had promised was inside her all along, a secret she kept safe from a world that had given her no chance at all. It was a Tuesday, cold and damp, the kind of day that seeps into your bones and makes you feel older than you are. She was sitting in the community center, waiting for her mother to finish her cleaning shift there. The center smelled of floor, wax, and old coffee, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights was a constant, sleepy drone. She was pretending to read a book she'd already read 3 times, just to have something to do. That's when she saw it. Taped to the bulletin board, lost among notices for bake sales and yoga classes, was a splash of bright, glossy paper. It didn't belong there. It was too vibrant, too full of promise for a place so used to the quiet routines of everyday life. She stood up, her heart giving a little thump of curiosity. The flyer was for the Westbrook Conservatory. The name itself sounded fancy, a world away from her neighborhood. It showed a picture of a grand building with tall windows and a gleaming piano. And in big, elegant letters, it announced the annual Young Artists Scholarship Competition. The words that made her breath catch in her throat were right at the bottom. Full ride scholarship. It meant everything. It meant books, a dorm room, lessons from the best teachers. It meant a future. But more than anything, it meant money. Money that could pay for a better doctor for her mother, for medicine that wasn't the cheapest kind, for a life where her mother didn't have to work 2 jobs until her body gave out. In that moment, the flyer wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a life raft in a deep, dark ocean. She carefully pulled one of the little tabs with the phone number on it, her fingers trembling so much she almost ripped it. She folded it into a tiny square and hid it in the innermost pocket of her worn jacket. For 2 days she didn't look at it. She was afraid to. Hope was a dangerous thing. It was a heavy, fragile bird that could easily break its wings. But on the 3rd night, after her mother had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted, she took it out. She stared at the tiny, crumpled number, and a quiet, fierce resolve settled in her chest. She had to try. Getting the application was the easy part. Filling it out was harder. It asked for her musical history, her awards, her teacher's name. She had none of those things. She left those sections blank, her stomach twisting with a familiar sense of inadequacy. For the teacher recommendation, she simply wrote, self-taught. It sounded pathetic, even to her. But when she got to the part where she had to describe what music meant to her, the words began to flow. She wrote about the quiet of the apartment, about the way the violin felt like an extension of her own body, about the song her mother said was inside her. She wrote until her hand ached, and then she mailed the envelope, dropping it into the big blue mailbox on the corner with a feeling that was equal parts terror and hope. It was done. There was no turning back. Weeks passed, each one feeling longer than the last. She tried not to think about it, throwing herself into her schoolwork and her late-night practice sessions. Then, one afternoon, a thin, official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. Her hands shook so badly she could barely tear it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with crisp, black lettering. She had an audition. A date, a time, and an address at the conservatory. When her mother saw it, she burst into tears, pulling her into a hug that smelled of bleach and lavender soap. "I knew it," her mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew they would hear you." The reality of the audition set in like a heavy fog. She had to choose a piece. She found a recording of a famous sonata, a piece that was known for its technical difficulty and its deep, emotional heart. It was a mountain of a song, full of fast, dizzying runs and long, haunting notes that required perfect control. It was the kind of piece that could win a scholarship or expose you as a complete amateur. From that day on, her life became a blur of practice. Every night, after the small apartment grew quiet, she would take out her violin. The sonata became her world, her obsession. The fast passages were a nightmare. Her tremor, which could sometimes add a soulful quiver to a slow melody, was a brutal enemy when it came to speed. Her fingers would stumble, tripping over each other, turning what should have been a sparkling cascade of notes into a messy, jumbled blur. She would practice a single measure, a few seconds of music, for 100 times, her jaw clenched in frustration, sweat beading on her forehead. Her shoulder would ache from holding the violin, her fingers would get sore, but she kept going. She imagined the judges' faces, their stern, critical expressions, and it pushed her to try again, and again, and again. The slow sections were just as hard, but in a different way. They demanded a steady, unwavering bow to draw out the long, singing notes. Her hand, her traitorous hand, would quiver, making the sound waver and shake, ruining the pure, clean tone she was desperate to achieve. She would close her eyes, trying to will her hand to be still, to become a rock. But it was no use. The shaking was a part of her, and it refused to be commanded. Some nights she would make a tiny bit of progress. A phrase would come out perfectly, a beautiful, shimmering moment of clarity that made her whole body tingle. Those moments were like drops of water in a desert. They were enough to keep her going, to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do it, desperate for guidance. She scraped together a little money from her part-time job at the grocery store and went to see a local music teacher. His studio was a small, cluttered room above a dusty music shop, smelling of old wood and rosin. He was a thin, tired-looking man with a permanent frown etched between his eyebrows. She explained about the audition, and he nodded impatiently, telling her to play. She was so nervous she could barely breathe. She raised the violin and played the opening of the sonata. It wasn't her best. Her nerves made the tremor worse, and the notes came out shaky and unsure. She only played for about a minute before he held up a hand, stopping her. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. He just sighed, a long, weary sound that was worse than any shout. He leaned back in his creaky chair and looked at her, not with anger, but with a kind of pity that was far more crushing. "Listen," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any kindness. "You have a feeling, I suppose. But your hands. The control just isn't there. A place like Westbrook, they're looking for perfection. They're looking for prodigies." He paused, tapping his fingers on his desk. "Have you ever considered a different hobby? Something that doesn't require such precision?" The words hit her like a physical blow. A different hobby. It was the same thing she'd been told her whole life, just in a different context. You can't write neatly, try typing. You can't hold the tray steady, be more careful. You can't play this music, try something else. She didn't say anything. She just put her violin back in its case, her face burning with shame, and walked out. On the bus ride home, she stared out the window at the passing city, the teacher's voice echoing in her head. A different hobby, he was right. Who was she kidding? She was just a girl from the wrong side of town with shaking hands, chasing a dream that was miles too big for her. The hope she had so carefully nurtured began to feel like a foolish, childish fantasy. The night before the audition felt different. The air in their small apartment was thick and heavy, not with the usual comforting quiet, but with a silent, buzzing tension. It was as if all the hopes and fears she had been carrying for weeks had decided to settle in the room, making it hard to breathe. The old clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a small hammering reminder of what was coming. Her mother had come home from her cleaning job, her face pale with a kind of exhaustion that went beyond a simple lack of sleep. She had tried to eat a little soup, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the spoon, before announcing she needed to lie down. "Just a headache, sweetie," she had said, forcing a weak smile. "I'll be fine. Just practice. Don't let me disturb you." But she was already disturbed. Seeing her mother so frail, knowing this audition was her one desperate shot at changing things, put a weight on her shoulders that felt as heavy as the world itself. She waited until she heard the soft creak of her mother's bed and the gentle click of the door closing. Then she took out her violin. The polished wood felt cool and alien in her hands. Tonight, it didn't feel like a friend. It felt like a test she was destined to fail. She positioned herself in the center of the small living room, the same spot she always practiced. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to imagine the grand hall at the conservatory. She tried to picture the judges, their faces neutral, their ears sharp. She raised the bow and began to play the sonata. From the very first note, she knew it was a disaster. The tremor in her hand, which she had been fighting for weeks, was worse than ever. It wasn't just a fine quiver. It was a violent, angry shake. A note that should have been pure and clear, a bell calling out in the silence, came out thin and warbling like a sick animal's cry. She tried to push through, to focus on the next phrase, but her fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled on the fingerboard. A fast run of notes, a cascade of sound that was supposed to sparkle and soar, became a frantic, clumsy scramble. It was just noise. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she whispered to the empty room. Again. She started from the top. The same thing happened. The opening note wobbled. Her fingers tripped. The music, which she loved so much, felt like it was fighting her, resisting her touch. It was like trying to hold water in her hands. The more she tightened her grip, the more it slipped through her fingers. A wave of hot frustration washed over her. She thought of the tired music teacher, his pitying voice. Asterisk, a different hobby. The words echoed in her head, taunting her. Asterisk, he was right. They're all right, asterisk, her jaw clenched. She wouldn't let it beat her. She thought of her mother, lying in the next room, her body wearing out from a life of hard work. This wasn't just for her. It was for her. She attacked the sonata with a desperate, fierce energy, putting all her anger and fear into the bow. She played faster, louder, trying to overpower the shaking in her hand with sheer force. But it was useless. The music became a distorted, angry shout. The beautiful, complex melody was torn to shreds by her lack of control, and then it happened. In the middle of a particularly difficult passage, her hand, slick with sweat and shaking uncontrollably, lost its grip. The bow slipped from her fingers. It didn't just fall. It seemed to leap from her hand, spinning in the air for a split second before hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, clattering crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent apartment. It skittered across the floor and came to a rest near the leg of the sofa. A dark, lifeless thing. That was the moment everything broke. It wasn't just the dropped bow. It was the dropped dream. The sound of it hitting the floor was the sound of her hope shattering into a million pieces. All the frustration, the fear, the shame, and the doubt that she had been pushing down for months came rushing up all at once, a tidal wave that crashed over her and pulled her under. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, painful sound. She didn't try to stop it. She sank to the floor, the heavy violin still clutched under her chin, and the tears began to fall. They weren't quiet, gentle tears. They were hot, heavy, and full of despair. She curled into a ball on the worn carpet, the violin pressed against her chest, and wept. She wept for the wasted hours of practice, for the cruel words of the teacher, for the judges she would never impress, and most of all, for the mother she was failing. She was a fool. A girl with shaking hands, chasing a fantasy. It was over. She was done. She didn't know how long she lay there, lost in the darkness of her own misery. The world had shrunk to the size of her own grief. But then she heard a soft creak. She didn't look up. She heard the quiet shuffle of slippers on the floor. A shadow fell over her. She expected a lecture, a question, a word of disappointment. But none came. Instead, she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. Then her mother slowly lowered herself to the floor beside her, moving with a stiffness that spoke of her own pain. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there in the quiet darkness with her, a solid, comforting presence. She reached over and gently took the violin from her daughter's grasp, placing it carefully back in its open case. Then she took her trembling hand in both of her own, her touch warm and steady. She just held it, not trying to stop the shaking, just accepting it. After a long moment, her mother spoke, her voice soft and raspy with fatigue. "Hey," she whispered. Look at me." She slowly lifted her daughter's tear-streaked face. Her mother's eyes, though tired, were full of a love so deep it seemed to burn away some of the shame. "Forget them," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Forget the judges? Forget the conservatory? Forget that big, fancy song?" She paused, brushing a stray tear from her cheek with her thumb. "Remember when you were little and you had the nightmares? And I would sing to you that little song? The one about the sparrow?" Her daughter nodded, a fresh wave of tears welling up in her eyes. "Play for me," her mother said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not for them. Just play our song. Play it for me." The words cut through the noise in her head. Our song, it wasn't a sonata. It wasn't a test of speed or perfection. It was a simple old lullaby, a melody that was woven into the fabric of their lives. It was the first song she had ever learned to play on the violin. It was the sound of safety, of love, of home. With a deep, shuddering breath, she nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and slowly picked up the bow. Her hand was still shaking, but it felt different now. It didn't feel like a betrayal. It just felt like her hand. She didn't stand up. She just sat there on the floor with her mother, the open violin case beside them. She closed her eyes, and instead of picturing a grand hall, she pictured her mother's face. She raised the violin, and as the bow touched the strings, the first note that came out was not perfect. It was a little wobbly, a little unsure, but it was honest. It was filled with all the pain and the love of the night. And as she continued to play the simple, haunting melody of their song, the shaking in her hand didn't go away, but it didn't matter anymore. Because she wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story. And for the first time all night she was telling the truth. The morning light was gray and thin, slipping through the gaps in the worn blinds of their apartment. It didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like the end of a very long, very difficult road. She woke up on the sofa where she had fallen, asleep after her mother had guided her back from the floor. The violin case was closed and sitting on the coffee table like a guest who had overstayed its welcome. Her mother was already awake, moving quietly in the small kitchen. The air between them was not filled with encouraging words or last-minute advice. It was filled with a quiet, shared understanding. Her mother placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of her and a glass of orange juice, a small luxury. She ate without tasting it, the food a bland, necessary fuel. Getting ready was a silent ritual. She put on her only good skirt, a plain black one that she had hemmed herself, and a clean white blouse. The clothes felt like a costume, belonging to a girl who was confident, who belonged in fancy places. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else in them too, a kind of calm. The storm of the night before had passed, leaving behind a strange, still landscape. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't hopeful. She was just going to do what she had to do. The bus ride to the other side of the city was long. She watched her neighborhood fade away. The familiar stores and crumbling buildings replaced by manicured lawns and tall, gleaming office towers. It was like traveling to a different country. The conservatory was even more intimidating up close than it was on the flyer. It was a massive old building made of stone and glass, looking like it had been there for 100 years and would be there for 100 more. The front doors were huge and made of dark, polished wood. When she pulled one open, the air that rushed out to meet her smelled different. It smelled of old wood and dust and something else, something like history and ambition. Her own footsteps on the marble floor sounded too loud, like clods of dirt falling on a clean floor. Girls and boys who looked like they belonged there walked past, carrying expensive instrument cases and chatting in loud, confident voices. They didn't even see her. She was a ghost in their world. A kind-looking older woman at the front desk pointed her down a long hallway to the audition waiting room. It was filled with more of the same confident young musicians, some practicing their scales on flutes and clarinets, others quietly reviewing sheet music. She found an empty chair in the corner and just sat, her violin case on her lap, feeling like an imposter. She didn't take out her music. She didn't practice. She just sat there, watching the second hand of a large clock on the wall sweep away the minutes. Finally, a door opened and a man with a serious face called her name. Her heart gave a single hard thump. This was it. She stood up, her legs feeling strangely distant, and followed him down another hallway and into a large, empty room. It was the audition hall. The ceiling was high and the walls were paneled in dark wood that seemed to soak up all the sound. At the far end of the room, 3 people sat at a long table. They were the judges. A woman with silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her forehead. A man with glasses that sat low on his nose, making him look over them with a permanent air of suspicion. And the youngest one, a man with a bored, tired expression, who was already tapping a pen against his clipboard, as if he couldn't wait for the day to be over. She walked to the center of the room, the squeak of her worn shoes on the polished floor echoing in the silence. She placed her case on the floor and opened it. Her hands were shaking, a familiar, constant tremor. The board judge glanced at her hands, then at her frayed clothes, and made a small, almost invisible mark on his paper before she had even played a single note. The woman with the tight hair gave her a thin, impatient smile. "Whenever you're ready," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. She took out her violin. She also took out the sheet music for the sonata, the mountain of a song she had been trying to climb for weeks. She placed it on the stand. The black notes seemed to swim on the page, a jumble of impossible instructions. She remembered the teacher's pitying sigh, * a different hobby. She remembered the feel of the bow slipping from her sweaty hand, the sharp, ugly crack as it hit the floor. She remembered the crushing weight of her own despair. Then she remembered something else. She remembered her mother's hand, warm and steady, covering her own. She remembered her soft, tired voice, * forget them. Forget the big, fancy song. Play our song. * She stood there for a long moment, looking at the sonata music. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached out and took the sheet music off the stand. She folded it once, twice, and slipped it back into her case. The judges exchanged a quick, confused glance. The man with the glasses raised an eyebrow. She was not going to play the sonata. She was going to play the simple lullaby. The song about the sparrow. She was going to play for her mother. She closed her eyes. She didn't see the grand hall or the stern faces of the judges. She saw her mother's tired, loving smile. She saw their small living room, the worn-out sofa, the crack in the linoleum. She raised the violin to her shoulder, her hands still trembling. But as she drew the bow across the strings, the tremor began to change. It was still there, a tiny, frantic heartbeat beneath her skin, but it was no longer the master of her hands. It had become a part of the music's soul. The first note that filled the room was not technically perfect. It was a little wobbly, fragile, like a newborn bird taking its first breath. But it was drenched in a raw, honest emotion that silenced the tapping of the board judge's pen. The music that followed was not a performance. It was a story. It was the story of a quiet girl, of a mother's sacrifice, of a struggle no one else could see. The simple melody, usually so plain, was transformed by the depth of feeling she poured into it. It spoke of loneliness and of finding a voice in the silence. It spoke of frustration and of a love that could weather any storm. Her hands, which had been a source of shame her entire life, were now the vessel for this incredible, heartbreaking story. The tremor in her bow added a unique, soulful vibrato, a quaver of pure humanity that no perfect, machine-like playing could ever replicate. The judges sat frozen. The woman with the tight hair leaned forward, her critical expression melting away into one of stunned disbelief. The man with the glasses pushed his glasses up his nose, his eyes wide. The bored judge was no longer bored. He was sitting perfectly still, his mouth slightly agape, his pen forgotten on the table. The air in the room, which had been so clinical and cold, was now thick with unspoken emotion. The music swelled, not with volume but with heart. It was the sound of a soul finally being set free. She played the last note of the lullaby and let it hang in the air, a single, shimmering thread of sound that slowly faded into absolute silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The clock on the wall seemed to have stopped. She opened her eyes, her chest heaving, and saw the three judges staring at her, their professional masks completely gone. They were no longer judges at a table. They were just three people who had been deeply, profoundly moved. Then the woman with the silver hair slowly rose to her feet. She began to clap. It was a single soft sound at first, then it grew stronger. The other two judges immediately joined her, their applause building into a heartfelt, thundering ovation that filled the grand hall and washed over her, a wave of acceptance she had never in her life dared to imagine. The sound was the first thing that registered. It wasn't just clapping. It was a physical force, a wave of warmth and noise that washed over her, pushing back the cold silence that had filled the room just moments before. Her chest was heaving, each breath a ragged pull of air. For a second, she was disconnected from it all, floating somewhere above the scene, watching a girl in a plain black skirt stand frozen in the center of a grand hall while three important people stood and clapped for her. It felt like a dream, the kind that's so wonderful you're terrified to wake up. The applause continued, growing louder, more insistent, and it slowly pulled her back down into her own body, into her own shaking hands. The woman with the silver hair was the first to move. She walked around the long table, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving the girl's face. The other two judges followed, their expressions still clouded with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The room felt smaller now, less intimidating. The high, dark wood walls seemed to be leaning in, not to judge, but to listen. The woman stopped a few feet in front of her. The applause from the two men faded into a respectful silence, but the woman kept her gaze steady, a look of profound wonder on her face. "That was not the sonata," the woman said. Her voice was no longer sharp and clipped. It was soft, almost reverent. The girl could only shake her head, unable to find her voice. "Who was your teacher?" the woman asked, the question hanging in the air between them. It wasn't an accusation or a challenge. It was a genuine, desperate plea for understanding. "We have to know. Who taught you to play like that?" The girl thought of the tired music teacher who had told her to find a new hobby. She thought of the countless hours spent alone in her living room, struggling with a piece of music that was too big for her. And then she thought of the night before, of the floor, of the tears, and of her mother's hand covering hers. She thought of the simple lullaby, of the promise it held. She finally found her voice, and it was quiet but clear. "My mother," she said. The answer seemed to land in the room with the weight of a truth that needed no further explanation. The judges didn't look confused. They looked moved, as if they had been given the final, missing piece of a beautiful, heartbreaking puzzle. The man with the glasses took off his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed to hide the fact that his eyes were glistening. The bored-looking judge, who now looked anything but simply nodded, a slow, deep nod of understanding. The woman with the silver hair smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face, softening all its sharp angles. "Of course," she whispered. Then she spoke louder, her voice filled with a new energy. "The Westbrook Conservatory has been searching for technical perfection for over 100 years. We have produced some of the most flawless musicians in the world. But sometimes, in our search for perfection, we forget that music is not about perfection. It is about truth. And you, young lady, just filled this room with more truth than I have heard in my entire career." She took a step closer. "We would be honored if you would accept our scholarship. Not just the full ride. We want to provide you with the best teachers, the best instruments, anything you need. Because what you have, we can't teach. We can only help it grow." She didn't remember much of what happened after that. There were handshakes that felt surprisingly warm, a thick envelope with the official letter placed in her hands, and many kind words that seemed to float around her head like bubbles. The next thing she knew, she was standing outside the massive stone building, the bright afternoon sun feeling strange on her skin. She looked down at the envelope in her hand. It was real. She walked to the bus stop, her footsteps feeling lighter than they ever had before. The city, which had seemed so intimidating on the way there, now just looked like a city. The world hadn't changed, but the bus ride home was a blur. She clutched the envelope in her lap, her fingers tracing the raised gold letters of the conservatory's name. She wasn't thinking about the fame or the future as a famous musician. All she could think about was her mother. She thought about the worn-out sofa, the smell of bleach and lavender soap, the tired look in her eyes. This wasn't just her victory. It was theirs. When she opened the door to their apartment, the familiar, comforting smell of home washed over her. Her mother was at the small kitchen table, mending a tear in a work shirt. She looked up, her face a mask of anxious hope. She had been waiting. The girl didn't say anything. She didn't show her the letter. She just walked over to the coffee table, opened her violin case, and took out the instrument. Her mother watched, her hands frozen mid-stitch. The girl stood in the middle of the small living room, just as she had the night before, and raised the violin to her shoulder. She closed her eyes and she played the lullaby. She played it for her mother. But this time the song was different. It was not filled with the pain and desperation of the night before. It was filled with a quiet, shining joy. It was a song of gratitude, of love, of a promise kept. The notes, still touched by the gentle tremor of her hand, soared and danced in the small space, filling every corner with light. When she played the last note, she opened her eyes. Her mother was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. She slowly walked over and took the envelope from her daughter's hand. She didn't need to open it. She already knew. She pulled her daughter into a hug so tight it almost took her breath away. And in that hug, in the quiet of their small apartment, the girl knew she had already won everything that mattered. Starting at the conservatory was not easy. The other students were prodigies, kids who had been playing since they could walk and who could play the most difficult pieces with a precision that seemed inhuman. At first, she felt like an imposter again. But her teachers were different. They didn't try to fix her shaking hands. Instead, they helped her understand it, to channel it. They taught her that her unique vibrato, her soulful quaver, was a gift, a signature that no one else could replicate. She learned to blend her raw, emotional storytelling with the technical skills they taught her, creating a style that was entirely her own. She never became a machine-like player. Her hands still shook, especially when she was nervous, but she was no longer ashamed of it. She learned that the most beautiful things in life often have flaws. A handmade ceramic bowl with a slight crack in the glaze, an old, patched-up quilt, a song played with a trembling hand. These imperfections were not signs of weakness. They were the marks of a life lived, of a story told. And her music, born from a struggle and fueled by a mother's love, told a story that no perfect, flawless music ever could. She had walked into a room where no one gave her a chance, and she had left with the whole world listening, all because she had finally learned to play the song that was already inside her.